Hadèch yaménou, Hadèch yaménou,
Bonjour à toutes, bonjour à tous. Pour ce numéro de Hadèch yaménou, on a le plaisir de recevoir le rabbin Haim Weiner. Bonjour. Bonjour monsieur. Vous dirigez le mouvement Massorti en Europe. Vous êtes notamment président du Beit Din Massorti sur tout le continent, ce qui vous amène à beaucoup voyager, à faire le tour des communautés. Avant d'évoquer cette importante fonction très spécifique, un mot peut-être du mouvement Massorti lui-même, en Europe et dans le monde. Comment se porte-t-il? Quel est son bulletin, j'allais dire, de santé, de bonne santé?
Okay, the Massorti movement worldwide is a very big movement. So we're about 1,000 synagogues around the world, and about 1,800 rabbis, and about 1.5 million members around the world. And in different places, it's different. The big weight of the movement is in the United States, where there are 650, 700 different synagogues. The movement is very large in South America, where there's 40 synagogues, let's say, mainly in Argentina, but also in other South American countries. And then we're smaller in Europe and we're smaller in Israel, but we are a growing movement, particularly in Europe and particularly in Israel. It's a growing movement. Statistics in the United Kingdom, where I live, show that the Jewish community in general is shrinking, and only two parts of the Jewish community are growing. The ultra-Orthodox are growing because they have a big birth rate, and the Massorti movement is growing because it attracts members from the other movements.
Vous avez parlé d'Israël. Quelle est la situation là-bas du mouvement Massorti, qui n'est pas toujours reconnu, on va dire, sur un pied d'égalité avec les autres courants?
Right. So the Massorti movement in Israel is about 80 communities, I think. And it's always been a growing movement, but it's very small. As you know, there's a lot of government aid that goes to religious communities, but only Orthodox religious communities. Non-Orthodox communities don't receive any government aid, so it's an uphill battle. The politics are difficult, and the funding is difficult. But I think that people are looking for an alternative. People find the politics around religion in Israel is very difficult, and they want alternatives. They want egalitarian alternatives. They want more liberal alternatives. They're looking for something that allows them to live spiritual lives, but not to feel under the control of the Orthodox rabbinate in Israel. So all of those forces help the movement grow, but it's a difficult battle because objectively, it's difficult to make it happen.
Yeah. Il y a aussi le mouvement moderne orthodoxe qui est né en Israël aussi. Finalement, ça fait une concurrence avec les Massorti, c'est une complémentarité. Comment vous avez des relations avec eux?
Right, so none of the movements fit very well into boxes. So Orthodoxy covers from ultra-Orthodox to a very liberal kind of Orthodoxy that's emerging today. The Massorti movement spans from very liberal to quite traditional. And the Reform movement also covers a large range of different religious practices. The very traditional part of Massorti isn't that different from the very liberal parts of Orthodoxy, although those on the inside would be aware of different barriers to that. I think the Massorti kind of is in the middle of the religious spectrum. It tries to hold on to two sets of values that don't always live well together. We try to be true to Jewish tradition, to an understanding of commitment to halakha, and at the same time to be true to Western, liberal, open values, democratic values, and you know, we try to be true to both of those things, and that makes life difficult sometimes.
Voilà, centre de gravité, on va dire, le mouvement Massorti, centre de gravité de tous ces courants. Effectivement, dans le judaïsme, il y a beaucoup de courants, puis à l'intérieur des courants, il y a aussi beaucoup de courants. On va en venir à vos activités en tant que président du tribunal rabbinique européen. Est-ce que vous pouvez nous dire quelles sont vos principales fonctions, occupations, de quoi vous occupez-vous principalement dans cette fonction de président du tribunal?
Right. So we're committed that every single one of our communities has access to all the religious services that it needs. So there are some religious services that a community can provide, and there are some religious services that the rabbi of the community can provide. But there are some things that can only be done by a Beit Din, and particularly small communities that don't have rabbis don't have access to some major religious services. So the main things that we do is we're in charge of the conversions that take place in our communities. We're in charge of divorces, gitin, for our community. In some countries, we also do kashrut supervision. That's particularly in the United Kingdom, but not only. We deal with some mediation and arbitration, particularly within communities and sometimes between communities and their rabbis. And we deal with some halachic decision-making, but only in areas that apply to the entire movement, not to a single community.
Oui. Justement, sur ces questions halachiques, purement halachiques, quelles sont-elles? Pouvez-vous nous donner des exemples de décisions sur quel domaine vous devez intervenir pour prendre une décision de nature halachique aujourd'hui?
So the Beit Din, as I said, deals with things that would apply to the whole movement. So certainly questions of Jewish status. We don't want someone to be considered Jewish in one community and not Jewish in another community. So that's a question that we deal with. But when we had fundamental discussions about same-sex couples in our communities, how they're treated in the community, whether we do marriages or we don't do marriages, those kinds of discussions would take place at the Beit Din level and not an individual community, because we don't want individual rabbis and communities having different policies, so that someone could get married in one community and not get married in another community.
Oui, c'est une unification de la halakha. Mais par exemple, sur des décisions qui concernent le Shabbat ou des choses plus fondamentales, est-ce que vous prenez des décisions aussi sur ces questions, ou est-ce que c'est au niveau mondial, Massorti, qu'il existe un tribunal qui prend ce genre de décision?
Okay. So a question about Shabbat, if it's unique to a community, the rabbi of the community will make that decision. If it's a policy for the whole movement, that wouldn't take place in a Beit Din, because the Beit Din is like a court. It decides cases. It doesn't make law. There's something called the Law Committee.
Okay.
Its official name is the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards. And that is part of the Rabbinical Assembly, and it's based in New York. And when it comes to making law, or deciding big questions of halakha, that takes place in the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards. So I'll just give you an example. Recently there was a discussion in that committee about the status of electric cars on Shabbat. We know that driving a regular car on Shabbat, there's sparks and fire in the engine, and that's clearly something that one can't do on Shabbat. But electricity has a different status. Electricity isn't fire. And exactly when you can use electricity and when you can't use electricity, and how that would be done is actually much more complicated. So that was a question that was debated in the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards. I actually wrote that decision for that committee, and I wrote no, but it was very interesting discussions. I think the whole question of electricity on Shabbat, and particularly electronics on Shabbat, is something where we will see a lot of creativity, not only in the Massorti world, but also in the Orthodox world.
Alors aussi un autre aspect dont on peut dire un mot, ce sont les conversions au judaïsme. Est-ce qu'il y en a beaucoup? Quel genre de personnes viennent se convertir chez les Massorti? Quels sont les profils?
So people come in through our communities. I get lots of emails from people just from nowhere saying, I want to convert, and we don't respond to those, or we can't answer those questions, because people convert through communities and not just online as individuals. In Europe, we're different, I think, than any other Beit Din in the world. I would say that when I speak to my colleagues in other countries, the most common scenario is someone has met a Jewish partner and they want to convert before they get married because they want to create a Jewish home together. In the European Massorti Beit Din, the biggest category is people who have Jewish background and Jewish history, and they're trying to connect to that Jewish history. There are two things that drive that. Certainly, we're a post-Shoah generation, and there are people who lost their families in the Shoah. They're discovering that they had Jewish grandparents, their Jewish great-grandparents. They're discovering that maybe sometimes even that they had Jewish parents and that they lost those parents and they were given away. So after the Shoah, there's people looking to connect to their families. In Spain and Portugal, it's very common for people who know that they have Jewish background, even going back 500 years through the Inquisition, and they're trying to gain a connection to their Jewish history. And then there's also people who maybe don't have direct Jewish connection, but they became interested in Judaism through that history. People in Poland and people in Germany who perhaps were on the other side of during the war, but now looking at that history feel an affinity to Judaism and they want to draw close to Judaism. So we also have many people who have found Jewish partners, but they're not our biggest category. Our biggest category is people trying to claim their own history.
Alors, une dernière question peut-être sur la politique. Le mouvement Massorti prend parfois aussi des positions politiques, on va dire, notamment sur la situation en Israël. Quel est votre sentiment sur ce qui se passe aujourd'hui? Qu'est-ce que le 7 octobre va changer selon vous? On parle parfois d'un retour de l'identité juive plus forte chez les Juifs notamment. Comment vous percevez la situation?
Right. So first of all, the 7th of October was difficult for everyone as a Jewish person. I don't think there's a particularly Massorti perspective towards that. Our communities have members of all different kinds and shapes. So some people are politically more to the right and some people are politically more to the left, although I think that we tend to have a more liberal membership. But what happened to the Jewish people on the 7th of October didn't differentiate if you were on the right or if you're on the left, or if you're pro-peace or you're anti-peace. I think everyone was totally appalled and totally in shock, and that shock went through all of our communities. And just like Jews everywhere, we follow what's happening in Israel because we have our children there and we have our cousins and we have our families there, and for everyone it's very, very close. And everyone feels that like they themselves are engaged. And at the same time, the conflict in Israel is spilling over to the streets in Europe. So there's a rise in anti-Semitism everywhere. And I'm sure that you feel that here in France, and we feel that in the United Kingdom, where there are huge demonstrations on the streets of hundreds and thousands of people that can feel very intimidating. And Jews everywhere are kind of being very careful. We don't feel as safe in Europe as we used to. I travel through communities everywhere. And it is different from country to country. I know, like in the United Kingdom, people put up posters of the hostages with pictures and say, right, we need to free the hostages. They get torn down. The life of a poster in London is maybe 10 minutes. It doesn't last longer than that. But I was speaking with my colleague who's a rabbi in Prague, and he said in Prague those posters are everywhere. And just once someone pulled down some of those posters, and hundreds of local Czech people came out to put the posters back up, and they didn't want the posters removed in Czechia. And that's very different, of course, from our experience in more Western Europe. I was 3 days ago, I was in Budapest, and there was an Israeli restaurant, had a big Israeli flag over the restaurant, and again, pictures of the hostages in the windows. And I said to a colleague of mine, in London, Israeli restaurants try to hide that they're Israeli restaurants. They would do nothing in public because they're afraid of vandalism. And my colleague just said, it's just not like that in Hungary.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup, Haim Weiner, pour tous ces témoignages. Donc, je rappelle que vous êtes le président du tribunal. Vous êtes aussi responsable donc de tout le mouvement Massorti en Europe. Vous voyagez beaucoup. Vous êtes donc aujourd'hui à Paris. Merci d'avoir accepté de répondre aux questions d'Adat Shalom. Merci à tous pour votre attention. On se retrouve dans une quinzaine de jours pour un nouveau numéro de Hadèch Yaménou. Merci.
La 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 la